Good afternoon. Okay. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. It's good to have you here. Welcome to today's webinar on the implications of open source large language models for Africa. So this webinar is sort of the last of our three-part series. So we've been having a series on how open innovation can support, inclusive and sustainable artificial intelligence ecosystems on the African continent. So today we are going to be exploring how, in particular, how open source large language models can support development in Africa. So we want to, first of all, identify responsible and localized LLM use cases across different priority sectors on the continent. So be it health, education, agriculture, name it. And then we want to look at sort of the infrastructure and data need, that needs to power this development. And finally, we will discuss some policy frameworks that are needed to sort of prevent misuse and foster inclusive innovation. So before we begin, I'm going to do a quick introduction of the Global Center on AI Governance and sort of take you through a journey on the work that we do. So the work that we do is divided into sort of four parts. We pride ourselves at the GCG as Africa's first dedicated think tank on AI governance. And we sort of represent the African continent, and not just the African continent, the global majority voice in AI policy and governance. So we work to shape fair and inclusive technology development. So on our work front, we mostly work on research and evidence generation. So that front of our work is divided into two. Two of our flagship projects are the Global Index on Responsible AI. Some of you would have followed this work over the last 2 to 3 years that it's developed. So we are looking to actually launch the next edition next year. We're working on that right now. We also have the African Observatory on Responsible AI, which is sort of a repository or one-stop shop for everything research, use cases, and policy frameworks, excuse me, on African hair development. We also work on capacity strengthening and training. So we've been doing a short course with the University of Cape Town on African AI ethics and policy. I know a couple of you would have, joined this course. We've also had a course with the University of Pretoria on African AI and human rights, which is sort of an introductory course to AI governance from a rights-based perspective on the continent. We are also part of the Africa Asia AI Policymakers Network, which is a gathering of policymakers across the African and Asian continent, a gathering of policy institutions across the African and Asian continent. We're also involved in advisory and technical assistance. We've been working with UNESCO, the African Union, the FCDO, and several other international institutions on several issues on AI governance on the African continent. We are part of the African Commission on Human Rights and People's Rights Advisory Board on AI and human rights. So our work is really broad, and I invite you to sort of check us out. You can follow us on social media on LinkedIn. You can check us out online on our website, and we hope you find our work very useful. Okay, back to today's webinar, really. So joining me today are two phenomenal figures in AI development on the continent. I've got with me Dr. Rachel Adams, who is our CEO at the Global Center on AI Governance. I've also got Dr. Ernest Mwembaze, who is a phenomenal figure on AI development on the continent. So just to quickly introduce the two speakers, Dr. Adams is a research associate of the Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence at the University of Cambridge and of the Ethics Lab at the University of Cape Town. She holds degrees in international human rights law and philosophy. She has served on numerous international expert committees, including for UNESCO, the UN, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the Global Partnership on AI. Dr. Adams is the CEO of the Global Center, as I mentioned. Let me also add that Rachel and Dr. Scott Mahoney have written a policy brief on this topic, on which we will sort of anchor our conversation today. Melanie, if you could just pop up the link to the policy brief in the chat, that would be good, so people can have a look. Dr. Ernest has had a dual career in academia and in industry. He has over 10 years of teaching experience in computer science and machine learning. While at Makerere University, he co-founded the Makerere University Artificial Intelligence Research Lab, leading it to prominence in the field of practical implementation and deployment of AI solutions. In industry, he has worked at the Google AI Research Lab in Ghana and the UN Pulse Lab in Kampala, where he focused on practical applications of AI to tackle developmental challenges in agriculture, utility estimation, and other focus areas of the SDGs. Dr. Ernest is passionate about using AI to improve society, particularly in developing countries. He's currently the executive director of Sunbird AI. Welcome, Dr. Ernest, and welcome, Dr. Rachel Adams. I'll start with you, Rachel. Maybe you could give us a little presentation on the implications of open source LLMs on the African continent.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ayantola. And really good to see so many of you with us today. So I'm going to be talking about a policy brief, which is the last in the series that we've been talking about over the last few weeks, that was commissioned by Meta and work that we did with some experts with us at the Global Centre. And this was the authorship of this was led by Scott Mahoney, and then I came on board as a second author. So forgive me if there are complex technical issues around open source LLMs that I can't answer as well. I'm going to talk you through the kind of high level insights that we laid out in this brief about the opportunities and the challenges of open source LLMs for advancing inclusive economic growth and development on the African continent, and then present a series of recommendations that we put forward about how we can harness the opportunity and how we can address some of the challenges that we've identified. So really, there's this significant promise that comes out of the kind of long history of open source technologies as this vehicle for enabling a much larger collective of entrepreneurs and individuals and groups to be able to remold and reshape these technologies for local and more discrete purposes. So open source large language models are language models that are freely available to download and to reuse, therefore kind of promoting ideas of transparency in terms of how these models are built, collaboration in terms of making them more available to more people, and then enabling innovation from the kind of much larger cohort of people that can utilize freely available models. So they really are quite an exciting opportunity insofar as LLMs differ from earlier forms of more kind of predictive AI technologies, insofar as they are much more generalizable in purpose. And so they can be used, I'm sure many of you know this very well, but as far as as wide as the human imagination are the potential applications of this technology. And one of the things we have identified time and time again is the need to support local innovators to design locally relevant tools, AI tools, to solve local problems and to advance local solutions to local problems. And open source LLMs are a tool that helps us along this path. So providing these tools without the prohibitive costs of proprietary models, being able to locally refine and tune them with local data, with local languages, which can then drive innovations across a wide range of sectors on the continent. We've seen all sorts of LLM applications arising in healthcare, both in health systems and in diagnosis, financial services, LLMs, including kind of personalized chatbots in Nigeria that provide advice on an individual basis to people for how to manage their finances in agriculture and in government and social services. So they're this kind of important component on this pathway to building more agency within the African continent around how we can build the technologies needed to address our issues without this kind of strong dependency on global tech players. And because they are free to access and free to download and reuse, they are, really considered to align with the principles of democracy, which is part of this kind of long history of openness, open source, transparency, and so forth. However, we have been working with innovators across the African continent, but also across the majority world over the past couple of years, particularly with a set of grantees from the Gates Foundation who are exploring with how large language models can be used to help address local problems. And many of them have used these kind of open source LLMs. So Llama for Meta is kind of considered to be one of those kind of key open source LLMs. And through this process of working with many innovators across the continent and globally, we've identified a series of kind of systemic and chronic challenges that the continent faces and that innovators face to really seize the opportunity for these technologies to kind of catalyze inclusive and diverse development and economic growth and so forth. So one of these comes down to what we mean by openness, and there's really quite a significant debate, more so with open source AI than with other earlier open source technologies, about what does openness mean in this context. Because very often the weights might be open, certain kind of foundational algorithms might be open, but there's not openness around the data used in the training of these models. And sometimes there's transparency around the kind of sources of data that went into training these models, but not actually this is the data that was used. And this creates a whole load of complexities for local innovators who are then trying to guess and understand the limitations, particularly the kind of biases these models have, which very much comes down to what were they trained on, what was the data they were trained on, what data sources may they be missing, what groups may they not have been may not be represented in the data they're using. So these kinds of varying degrees of openness really do pose a challenge. And I know there's been really interesting scholarship and critique about kind of open washing and the degree to which these technologies, AI technologies in particular, are properly, freely, and openly available to use and reuse. Then the kind of second layer of challenges is around the computational demand to train and fine-tune LLMs to fit local contexts. And certainly speaking to innovators across the continent, the cost of compute and then the availability of compute tends to be almost the main challenge that they identify, because it's so kind of foundational to moving forward with any kind of innovation. Coupled with this, we have kind of high costs of cloud-based solutions that then really undermine this kind of principle of access, that openness is really about who has access and enabling a much wider range of access. But then this gets undermined at the second level of access to computing. I've spoken a little bit about that degree of openness, often not including the data that AI was trained on. So that's there in that fourth bullet point you see on the slide. And then another one that we've certainly seen is that at the Global Center for AI Governance is the lack of comprehensive governance around how AI should be ethically used on the continent. And this kind of causes a number of different things. One, it creates kind of uncertainty with innovators who are not sure whether they're on the right or the wrong side of the law, because there isn't express laws around how AI should be used ethically. There's also, on the other side, a kind of more conservative attitude that then deems any technology that uses any kind of AI-enabled health technology, for example, to fall under the definition of a medical device and therefore have to go through regulatory approval, even if it's just providing quite low-level advice that's really akin to kind of Googling your symptoms on Google. And that wouldn't have been something that would have required medical regulation beforehand. So our regulatory systems are just not fit for purpose yet for the kinds of innovations that we're seeing across the continent. One of the things that we've also identified is just a kind of oversight gap insofar as innovations, particularly those that are occurring outside of the university, where there's various kind of ethical oversight mechanisms, developing technologies, AI-driven technologies, for use in communities or use in society, and there's just no kind of oversight or independent review that ensures that these technologies are properly safeguarded. They're not causing more kind of bias. They're not creating complex systems where there's no opportunity for recourse or to demand a human in the loop to review a decision that may be made by a system and so forth. Coupled with that, we've of course got all the kind of privacy issues and the copyright issues as well that goes alongside the use of these really, really large data sets that could include copyright restricted information. And there's been various court cases in the US about AI models that have done just that. So in terms of how does the emerging policy framework and policy environment on the continent speak into some of these issues? We've identified these kind of 4 core frameworks that are relevant. One is the African Union's Continental Strategy on AI that was published last year, and that really emphasizes the need for African-centered AI development, for data sovereignty and inclusivity of African languages and cultures in AI development. And so open source LLMs really kind of align with these goals by enabling transparent AI models that can incorporate local data and insights. And then the AU Agenda 2063, the Africa We Want, speaks about the importance of innovation in sectors like agriculture, youth empowerment, and sustainable development, and enabling this innovation. It doesn't speak to AI specifically, but it speaks to the importance of innovation. And then, of course, open source creates this kind of tool for innovation. The AU Convention on Cybersecurity and Personal Data Protection, the Malibu Convention that very recently came into effect. It feels a little bit outdated at the moment, but certainly has some relevant provisions around data privacy and lawful data collection, which are provisions that open source LLMs would need to comply to. So when we're thinking about that kind of regulatory framework, there are already provisions that are relevant, especially around kind of cybersecurity and privacy. And then there's the 2022 AU Data Policy Framework that sets out these principles and guidelines for inclusive data governance, which are really, really important for kind of the data collection and processing work that goes into building and training and using these large language models. So I've got 2 more slides, Antola. I hope I'm not taking too long. I'm just going to go over the kind of recommendations that we put forward, Scott and I, in this brief. And I think one of the things to emphasize is that some of these ideas are really already starting to take place in different ways across the continent, different kinds of initiatives. So build distributed African AI computing infrastructure. There's the Equal compute network that's really thinking about how do we equitably and sustainably create compute capacity and enable those innovators that need it to be able to use it, including thinking about the value of kind of edge computing in areas that might have kind of limited connectivity. We need to increase transparency and flexibility in open source AI models so that we have this much more kind of proper realization of the principles of openness in open source technologies, AI technologies beyond open weights, to ensuring we know what's in the training data and how innovators can balance what might be unbalanced representation in those data sets. Ensure inclusive, ethical and inclusive AI development through regulatory or governance guidelines at national levels that can provide requirements for innovators for ensuring the implementation of ethical principles, ensuring that these technologies are inclusive by engaging with local communities and user groups and so forth. Also to think about establishing a kind of African AI consortium on open source large language models as a kind of platform to drive innovation, to drive knowledge sharing, and so forth. And I think some of these kinds of continental-wide networking and platforms already exist through kind of the Indaba platform, for example. And then launch an AI infrastructure fund to overcome cost barriers. This is something that, particularly since the Rwanda Global Summit on AI in Africa event that took place in April earlier this year, there's been a real kind of prioritization of the need for massive scale funding to support the compute and the infrastructure demands needed to kind of really build out what's possible with these technologies on the continent. And then a last few recommendations is how we kind of build education and awareness around AI and digital literacy. So working with educational partners across the continent to build capacity development initiatives that really kind of provide opportunities, particularly for marginalized communities and individuals to learn about AI and improve their AI skills. Establish a continental AI ethics board for governance and oversight. This is something we've been thinking a lot about at the Global Centre for AI Governance, is the need for some kind of independent review of AI projects at an early stage, particularly those that fall outside of a university and may pose very real risks to communities and need proper safeguarding. Strengthen international AI research partnerships and facilitate global collaboration to improve representation, transparency, inclusivity in AI development. You know, many of these models come from the US, and we need to work with partners globally to ensure that the development of these technologies really enable African participation, maybe kind of further upstream. Leverage regional networks for knowledge sharing and coordination, including kind of sharing knowledge and expertise, strengthening policy and technical understanding of these issues amongst different stakeholders. And I think there's a lot of those kinds of activities already taking place, which is so exciting to see. And then develop a continental open source AI risks and readiness framework in order to be able to track progress, establish a set of indicators around AI readiness for African countries that are relevant for African countries and enable progress, monitoring of progress over time. Ayatollah, I'm going to pause there. Thank you all very much and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Rachel. Really, really excellent presentation. Very comprehensive as well. Actually, you had about 4 minutes left, which is good. Gives us a bit of time to sort of unpack these issues a bit more. There's a lot to discuss in there, Rachel. You've touched on so many things, from infrastructure, the data around open source LLMs, increasing transparency. You touched on ethics and risk, regulation, and cost, especially when talking about infrastructure, which is sort of the big elephant in the room. Um, Before I invite Dr. Ernest to respond, I wanted to sort of highlight, I mean, what I saw in your presentation, this sort of dual, or if you like, dyadic nature of, open source LLMs, right? So on one hand, they have the unique advantage to sort of help local innovators build tailored solutions to, African development, needs, by bootstrapping innovation. So you have, a lot more people accessing particular solutions without the upfront, cost that's required to build their own compute from scratch or to collect their own data from scratch, right? So there's a, democratization of access here. But they also increase model security, right? So if a lot more people have access to this model, they can evaluate the model for vulnerabilities and safety, right? As opposed to proprietary models that are more difficult to scrutinize. But the challenge here also in the long run is a lot more people having access to, a model weight or, even the metadata increases security risks, right? Because, you could just tweak something in the model and, changes everything for everyone else. I wonder how you want to respond to that. I have a lot more of these dyadic sort of case studies. I don't know if you want me to give more examples, but I'm sure Dr. Ernest can respond to some of them. Rachel, yeah. So this one's for you.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, that's fine. That's if Ernest wants to come in, and then I'll respond afterwards.
Yeah, yeah, sure.
Yeah, sorry. Thanks. Yeah, no, thanks, Rachel, for the good summary of sort of the challenges around LLMs. Yeah, I think I didn't quite follow the question, but I think the I think
I,
this
I can
focus on. Oh, do you want to repeat it?
Very happy. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, so I was sort of just talking around, Rachel's point on increasing access, right, which brings about innovation and competition because a lot more people can have access to, model weights and data without necessarily the upfront cost of training their own models from scratch, right? But I also figure this increases the security of a model because a lot more people can have access to evaluate the models for vulnerabilities and safety. Um, but as well, it opens up the model to risks, right? So if a lot more people have access to it, that means a lot more people could potentially manipulate the data or model weightings or the codes, right, for malicious use. So how do we sort of balance these two competing narratives around open source development?
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, I think there's always trade-offs to these kinds of things, and I guess. I guess you could think of it in an Africa-centric way. You know, what would be the best thing for us? Would it be to restrict access and sort of increase on the security and the risk, or would it be to open up access and sort of try and mitigate the risk with that? And I think a lot of these things, I think many trade-offs are contextual in this case. But I think my feeling is like many other fields have done this. You know, there's been a lot of release in things like biodata, genetic data for crops. I started off from crops coming this side. In health, you know, I think in COVID was a very good example once they released sort of all this research. Then people were able to develop vaccines and things like this. And I think there are many other fields where access or release of this information or access to this information has sort of moved the needle of research ahead. So my feeling at this time, for example, in Africa, would be really opening up these models. Can people have access to the weights? Can people have access to the models? Can people have access to the data? And that alone would create a lot of innovation. Then the things like risk, then of course, access, as you said, I get the feeling that while there's a risk that, you know, people may misuse this access, I think there's also the other sort of conversations that people actually interrogate this data, interrogate these release things, and sort of you can build a good risk profile, you can sort of lock the holes. And this has worked in network security, so it should be fine. Yeah,
Yeah.
thanks.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Richard, do you want to respond to that as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with Ernest that we have to take a kind of attenuated African perspective on this debate. It's a very, 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 very interesting debate. I think it's also worth looking at kind of what does the evidence show around the use of these technologies on the continent? And my sense is that we've seen a lot of good uses, a lot of very interesting applications that are, led by groups that are really trying to make a positive impact on the continent. And a lot of the kind of misuse that we might have seen is either being kind of caught in the net of licensing, so, potential nefarious actors are not getting access to these models, or are not dependent on the fact that they're open, right? So yes, we've seen some kind of misuses being reported by OpenAI for ChatGPT across the continent. So the misuse, it's difficult to say how dependent that misuse is on the openness of these technologies, and how manipulatable, that's probably not a word, the kind of safeguards are, and how far those safeguards can be, the technical safeguards that you would have to kind of jailbreak out of that, how far are they kind of set in stone when a model is made completely open. I know Llama was used by the Chinese military to develop a application, some kind of military use application, and certainly Meta came back and said this is not what we intended this model to be used for, and we remain committed to the principles of openness. So my kind of broad sense at the moment is, while I really understand those kind of very serious questions around how far these models should be open source, let's look at the evidence of how beneficial open source technologies is for increasing innovation on the continent, which I think far outweighs the risk at the moment. And then let's think carefully about, the kind of safeguards and governance mechanisms that need to be put in place, including the safeguards that AI developers, I think, in the first instance, have to ensure are in place to ensure that they mitigate as far as possible the potential for misuse down the line.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. I think I certainly agree with you both in terms of first step is prioritizing innovation, right? And in doing so, kind of look at what the evidence is on the use cases, right? And in sort of developing those guardrails, from that we can get a sense of what sort of guardrails are needed to prevent misuse. For anyone who is interested in some of these good use cases, we've actually published another report. On Africa's AI landscape. And in it, section 2 of that report, we looked at so many different use cases on, I've just put the link in the chat, on open source LLMs on the continent across, priority sectors. Okay, let's go to the big elephant in the room, which is, compute cost, right? So we do know that open source LLMs build innovation, they boost innovation. People can build niche products without this sort of upfront cost of, data and training models. But in the first instance is the sort of infrastructure needed to actually train the models, right? So whoever is kind of taking this first big leap. And I think, Rachel, you did raise some nice ideas around, an African fund for this sort of things. I wanted Dr. Ernest to respond to that. How do you think African institutions collectively can lower compute costs, and should we consider an AI infrastructure fund that Rachel's talked about, and what are some nice ideas around going about this? I think you're on mute, Dr. Ernest.
Oh, you missed the first part. It was really good, but I
Oh,
won't repeat it. All right. So I just wanted to take you back to the very first time the deep learning in Daba started. So this is a huge network of mainly driven towards capacity building of African talent for machine learning. It was based on deep learning specifically, deep learning in Daba. And the key thing there was compute. And I remember the folks from Google came and they launched Google Colab. So you could get a free GPU on Google Colab that you could start to train these AI models. Then, the scale and the need for compute was not as much as we need it now. But it was sort of a scalable way for people to start training these models. And now you can hardly train a medium-sized model. So a medium-sized model now has maybe 30 billion parameters, 12 billion parameters, a Quinn model, about 30. So you can't even train this on a Google Colab that is freely available. At Sanbadia, we train these, we're building these LLMs for local languages. And it costs us almost $200 to train 4 epochs, 4 runs of training. And this just like 2 days. So there's a huge need for compute. This cannot be understated. And there are 2 things. I think here, maybe I just answer the question 2 things. One, why do we need compute? And who needs the compute? So why do we need the compute? What do we need it for? One is to train these models better. We could reduce the size of the models. That could solve part of the compute problem. And there are many initiatives there, things called small language models that are sort of being built, where if you constrain the problem, then maybe you need less compute. But even with those, as we say, the medium-sized models still need several compute. Then the other aspect is who needs the compute. And these are sort of, we have universities, private sector, enthusiasts, governments. And so this begs the question, can we do an Africa continental AI compute strategy? And I think this is probably the right way to do it. And we've seen many Africa sort of wide projects. Of course, in practice, they work, it's Africa-wide, but then you have regional hubs, and then you have sort of universities, you have small organizations, private sector. But this is not totally impossible. We've seen it with telecom networks. You have MTN sort of across Africa, with Airtel, and many other networks. I think this is definitely possible if we do it in sort of a hierarchical way.
Right. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much. I think I'll just take this opportunity to invite you to respond to one of the questions just because you already touched on it. So Kojo Apiage, sorry if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly, raised the issue of, in the absence of, affordable and accessible compute, do you think would be better off just, focusing our efforts on smaller language models? I think Richard already answered this in some way, referencing Lelapa's work, but I wonder if you could expatiate a bit on this Dr. Ernest, because you mentioned it.
Yeah, so the smaller language models are good because they're robust and you can easily train them. But we've tried both here at Sunbird. What we find is that while the small ones are good for initial sort of testing, you want to test and see if your model sort of works, the things you're trying to innovate around work. We found that the bigger ones actually have larger capacity. So they are not big for nothing. They actually have larger capacity. They can do many more things. They have better performance gains. And so eventually, if you really want to build something that is solid, eventually you're sort of taken to the large language models. So it cannot be just a concentration of the small, but you also need to get the big. And what we do with the big, of course, you could go to the big and then you try and make them small, quantize them or do multiple things. But I think there's almost no way to escape the big ones if you want to do something really worthwhile.
Yeah, excellent. I think the question of compute is just there's no way around it, but working to provide the necessary resource for it. I'd invite people to drop their questions in chat. I'm just going to take them concurrently as I present mine. I wanted us to touch on data governance, right? I mean, one of the big things about open source LLMs is that we're saying, well, you need to open access to these models beyond just the model weights and codes. We need to have access to the data and as well as the metadata, right? About, information about the data you've used in training these models. But again, we know the question of trust comes in terms of data set, right? This information is these are people's real information, right? So Dr. Ernest, I wonder what I mean, Rachel raised the idea of a trusted African data set, right? What should this look like? You know, who should govern it?
Ooh, yeah, that's a tough question. I think data has been on our side, all the data sovereignty and etc. So data is a very tricky thing. As you say, so these models are trained with large amounts of data. And whose data is that? This data of the internet or data from people's published work or audio? I mean, normally people collect a bit of data, but this is the data for fine tuning. And this normally people can't release, but the actual data to train these base models tends to be big and hard to release. So how would it look like? I think for Africa, again, just coming to African context, I think we are benefiting a lot in sort of the next step of this. The technical is called supervised fine tuning. So you take a big model and sort of fine tune it for very specific problems. So we're doing one in maternal health, for example, in the AI for D consortium, the other people doing agriculture, the people doing languages. And you can collect, in Uganda here, I can collect a data set on Luganda language and maybe Rutoro and etc. The small languages here in Uganda. And while, if it's just three languages I've collected, there's a bit of, there's traceability. I can say, okay, I collected it from this community. Maybe the community has benefited from this in some way. And I think then that could be sort of pulled into a bigger data set. I think this would be the way I would envisage data sharing. So sharing, fine-tuning data. So the data just comes, that's for fine-tuning. And that has sort of some sort of accountability. And then the governance thing would be, how do we do a shared governance model? So these are fairly abstract things, but I think we're seeing them sort of happening with, for example, Masakani or the Africa AI Hub, which is sort of forming now. How can we have separate communities, universities, groups, enthusiast groups in different countries, collecting data, pulling it together in a certain way that makes it easy to share the data and use it responsibly? So I think I think it's not yet concrete, but my thought would be sort of that sort of hierarchical structure. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. What I'm getting from this is sort of starting from trusted institutions, you know, collecting the data, and then we rely on those sort of data because I mean, they are easily governable because we know them. Okay, let's move on from data. I can see a lot of questions in the chat about data. I'm going to come back to them. Rachel, you raised a very interesting issue around sort of adopting a unified open source LLM licensing standard. That seems a bit, you know, kind of long-winded technical stuff. What do you mean by that? And what's the goal? Who is this supposed to protect? I think it's a question around your discourse around regulation and governance.
Yeah, I mean, this was specifically speaking to how Llama, as an example of an open source technology, does not just, you can't just access the model without any kind of information about who you are and what you're going to use it for. And so effectively, you get granted a license in order to be able to use the technology. So it's just one kind of layer of being able to safeguard only to an extent who's using it and for what purpose. There's no kind of follow-up mechanism, as far as I understand, from Llama's side to ensure you've used it for the purpose that you said you're going to use it for. What I think, just to kind of link the previous conversation around data, because this is, you know, absolutely essential, and it's not just that we need to fine tune these models with African data. It's that very often we don't have the data available on key issues in machine readable format or even have that data. And so there's kind of really significant data collection exercises, you know, things like Mozilla common voice, to collect data in local African languages in order to create the kind of broad, fair, representative data sets that we need to fine-tune these models for local contexts. I think we need to really be approaching this, in the right way. It's an opportunity to collect data lawfully, fairly, educate people about their rights with respect to data. In fact, I don't feel that there's been any more important a moment for data protection, the whole data protection ecosystem here, as we're really kind of pushing forward on data collection. There's also been some really interesting work around data trusts. So how do we empower communities to have some kind of ownership over the data that they give, and create kind of more beneficial structures around what a kind of value chain for AI LLM development in Africa to look like. So I think that's quite interesting. I think connected with this, we've got groups across the continent who are collecting these really kind of very, very interesting, nuanced, discrete data sets, which then might get sucked up into these large language models from, foreign AI labs in a kind of copyright infringing kind of a way. And these groups that are doing that work of collecting these data sets just see no benefit because they are required to make them openly available, which we understand. But I think there's some really interesting work going on around kind of licensing data sets by Leo Matuku and Chijioke Okori, that I think is kind of presenting a new dimension, not just around the kind of end product of how do we create these LLMs from open source technology LLMs, but how do we think about the whole value chain supporting inclusive economic growth for the African continent as well?
Excellent. Thank you so much, Rachel. I think there's a question in the chat. I think it's just a good time to respond to this. So someone said many of the recommendations to create open source LLMs seem to focus on compute. I think our speakers have both addressed the question of data, but this person is asking that there's not much focus on creating open data in more regional language. So they're asking if the challenge of language data availability is solved. I guess just want to hear more on this. So Rachel, can you pick up on that? I think you already touched on this a bit, just a minute of elaborating. Yeah.
Yeah, great question. And I think what I was talking to previously was trying to get to this issue that when we're thinking about the LLMs and we're thinking about the computer, blah, 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 it's really crucial that we spend as much time thinking about the availability of the data we need. So no, it's not a solved issue at all, although I think there are important groups doing work to help solve this issue. But yeah, as I said, I think it's an opportunity to build data sets and potentially license data sets in ways that empower local groups and communities and individuals with their rights.
Excellent. Thank you. Just to say we've got about 10 minutes to go, so I might not be able to get to all the questions. I'll try my best to do that. So let's go to ethics and risk and governance. Again, I'll come back to you, Rachel, and I'm hoping Dr. Ernest can respond to this. You shared a bit about developing a continental AI risk and readiness profile. Can you elaborate on that, and what's the relevance of that for open source LLMs?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, you're talking to an organization that leads a global index. And so I think, we very much believe in this idea that, what is that phrase? Like, if you want to see something happen, you need to measure it. So it's very much about being able to provide concrete benchmarks that policymakers, decision makers, stakeholders in country can work towards meeting as a way of trying to break down this really kind of big, complex thing that AI has huge potential for the African continent, but how do we realize it? So one of those ways is to create benchmarks around the kind of issue areas, the indicators that we know are important around kind of data governance, around skills, around compute, and all those kind of things, in order to be able to assess not just progress and how far different countries are at this kind of readiness level, but really where are the gaps and where do we need to be prioritizing or focusing investment, or where are the kind of opportunities to do something quite catalytic. So for me, it's really about the kind of value of this kind of quantitative research to enable us to have a framework against which to make decisions and track progress over time.
Excellent. Yeah. Just to say to all our audience, we the Global Center on AI Governance, one of our flagship projects is the Global Index on Responsible AI, which is sort of our biennial global study to track responsible AI governance across the world. I think the last edition we covered over 138 countries. Do well to check it out. Global Index on Responsible AI. I'll invite Dr. Ernest to sort of respond to that very quickly. So yes, we have this sort of measurement and this work going on from the GCG and some other organizations, right? But kind of localizing to the African continent now in terms of especially the States, right? Dr. Ernest, do you think it's time for a continental AI ethics board? I think Rachel raised this idea. Do you think how do we go about this?
Expo. Did you say expo?
No, artificial intelligence ethics board.
Oh, board. All right, I thought expo.
Yeah,
I was
board.
like, yeah,
Sorry.
expo.
Yeah.
No, expo. Yeah, I think the yeah, so ethics definitely is important. And of course, I think people think about it differently. So developers, of course, think about it quite differently from policymakers. And of course, people using the technology also think quite differently, I would imagine, from the developers. So I think there has to be some sort of commonality in what people are talking about when they talk about ethics. But yeah, a global, I think we've seen it work in GDPR in Europe. We've seen things coming up in Canada, the US. So I think Africa also needs one for sure. I think we have very unique contexts here in Africa that we need to have our own separate sort of ethical board. So I would definitely, the short answer would be yes, and the long answer would be how do we make sure that we're not just copying from Europe and sort of dumping it here, but we are sort of getting to the nuances of what it means to be African, which is very hard because Africa is very, very diverse.
And Tolu, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I was just saying, thank you, Dr. Ernest. One last question for you. You've worked in the education sector, right? As a former lecturer, establishing research labs and all sorts. So someone's asking a question here. What implications do you see these issues having in the education sector? How can educators teach kids to interact with these issues and build literacy? Do you want to quickly respond to that?
Yeah, so I have two very opposing thoughts on this. One is to think of the internet, right? So when ICT was a big thing, the year 2000, the internet boom, we need to teach kids internet, ICT, how to use the internet. But now you don't think about how to teach kids to use the internet. They sort of automatically get it because the utility is so high. So one thing is not to focus on this too much. The kids will automatically sort of learn a lot of these things. The other extreme, of course, is that we need to teach them how to, maybe in education, how to build things responsibly, to skill them with the fundamental tools or fundamental knowledge about these technologies. Because right now it's very easy to write code. You go to ChatGPT and give you some code. You don't even need to understand the fundamentals. If it fails, you bring back the error to ChatGPT and it gives a solution. So there is a certain sort of laxity in learning on this side. It is another part where they automatically learn these things. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much. I guess there's one final question in chat. Maybe Rachel could take this. So this person sort of brings us back to the issue of trust and this public trust and distrust in AI. And they're asking, how do you see this affecting successful deployment of AI in different areas? You know, what can we do? This is about public trust and public use of AI.
Yeah, I love this question. I think this is a really, really important question. And I think we need to be foregrounding much more these questions of what do people think about AI? How do they want it to help them in their lives? How do they want it to be used? And I think what's really interesting is that local innovators often develop their technologies in conversation with local communities. And so they tend to be, more than anyone, the groups that kind of really, really know what the kind of attitudes and perceptions of different communities and societies are. I think particularly because we're seeing a rise in digital fraud, the question of trust is really, 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 really important because I think it's a barrier to scaling. And then at the Global Centre, under our African Observatory on Responsible AI project, we've actually just completed a really interesting public perception survey in South Africa around people's attitudes and perceptions and thoughts and feelings towards artificial intelligence, what they think it means, where they get their information from, when they think it should be used, when they think it shouldn't be used, how positive an impact they think it's having in their lives and will have in their lives. So watch this space because there's some really, really interesting data led by our senior researcher, Leah Yonk, who's here on the call, but lots of interesting insights coming out. And I think this is going to really help us kind of create that strong empirical foundation for policy making that's more kind of people driven. And we really, really hope to kind of take that survey into other African countries as well.
Thank you, Rachel. Excellent. Just before we go, I think my colleague Shailene is hoping to she wants to launch a poll just in chat. I'm not sure what it's about. Please do want to respond to the poll. And quickly, before we actually leave the call, I wanted to do a bit of marketing for our new website here. So we've just launched a brand new Global Center on AI Governance. You can call this GCG 2.0. So if you go on the website, it's globalcenter.ai. That's the web link. And I wanted to show you in particular our African AI policy tool. So if you come on the website, you go to this tab here on the left, and then you come to African Observatory. We've got the Africa Policy Tool, which is basically sort of repository of different policy frameworks. And in fact, we also have a repository of different research and use cases on AI on the African continent. So you will find this very interesting. Outside of the Africa AI Policy Tool, certainly there are a lot of research outputs that are related to the topic today. One of it is the State of AI in Africa Landscape Study. We've also got Rachel's and Dr. Scott Manny's policy brief on open source LLMs there. So do well to check it out and engage with us also on social media. Thank you very much, everyone, for making it here today. It's been an excellent, wonderful presentation. I enjoyed it myself. I took a lot of notes and hoping to see you again. And thank you, Rachel. Thank you so much, Dr. Ernest. Hope to see you again. Bye now.